First of all, welcome. I know we just heard Craig's amazing keynote, but otherwise, for folks who are just showing up, welcome to ISPS 2024. So I am actually speaking as part of this panel, while I'm also, I think as many of you know, the conference chair. So this panel features myself, Alison Branitsky, and Andrew Grundy, who is zooming in from the UK. Originally, we were trying to get him out here in person, but the timing just didn't work. So they will be talking about their work. I'm kind of going to introduce some of the themes here to get us started. Okay, so I will just be honest and say I got back just a few days ago from Trieste, Italy, from a very intensive, immersive study trip of the Trieste system, the Trieste approach, and have really kind of come back feeling quite profoundly unmoored. I sat down this week to try to put together this PowerPoint, and I really could not bring myself to create slides kind of featuring my research projects and work after seeing what I saw. And so I'm not. So this is a bigger picture presentation that is in part really a reflection on experiences in Trieste, and in part a reflection on our really incredible kind of reception kickoff panel last night for ISPS that I know some of you were at and some of you were probably not yet here in town. These pictures here are of what was the old psychiatric hospital in Trieste itself. And so as some of you probably know, kind of a key kind of motivating slogan of Basalian deinstitutionalization was freedom is therapeutic. And you see this kind of emblazoned permanently on the wall of one of the main buildings. The other is a banner that is up and flying right now in these times of neoconservative, neo-fascist resurgence across Europe. This is happening, obviously in the United States as well, and certainly in Trieste. But the message is Franco is alive and fighting with us. So the spirit of Basaglia lives in a fight that is not just about the mental health or social care systems, but is really about political liberation, emancipation, and Basaglia himself really got his start as an anti-fascist activist, right? So this was sort of in the wake of Mussolini. These are some more pictures, and these, I think, help bring to life just a little bit the very fundamental focus on the arts and culture, on declinicalizing and moving the frame away from the capture of clinical systems and towards other forms of emancipatory, liberatory practice. So here you see a theater group that Basaglia started himself that is going strong today. They're touring all over Europe. Translates as the Academy of the Mad. You see some of the artwork that is actually literally within the walls of the old state psychiatric hospital. So the sculpture on the, I guess, right side for most of you, this was created actually by Franco Basaglia's cousin, and it serves as a living reminder of what it means to restrain people, right? What it means to restrain them symbolically, as well as, you know, kind of physically. And there are reminders of the history everywhere you go, reminders of the history and reminders of the liberation. So the airplane that you see, Basaglia staged a sort of a performative carnival-like day of liberation, and he and the users, the former patients of the institution, along with artists and members of the broader community, created a life-sized cardboard airplane, and the airplane, among other kind of symbols operative in Trieste, really depicts liberation and freedom. So this is what I'm kind of coming from, and what do I come back to, right? What are we all of us here in the United States and in many, many other countries? I don't think things are especially different for folks in the room from the UK. In the US, in the starkest possible contrast to Trieste, we have naturalized violence in many forms directed against individuals experiencing psychosis or labeled with serious mental illness, right? That is epistemic. We exact violence on people through a claiming of knowledge, of authoritative knowledge about people's experiences, and using that to pathologize, using that to coerce, right? Literally people's symptoms and diagnoses form the basis for various forms of civil commitment. Relationally, it is enacted, and physically in confinement, which very much continues, obviously, in most countries to this day. Coercion is, in some sense in the US, coercion in the broad sense, meaning a continuum from so-called soft coercion to hard coercion, is the default standard of care, especially for folks with long-term psychiatric disabilities. Dehumanization at the level of clinical interactions is the standard of care, right? So within mainstream systems, which is like 99.9% of services in the United States, psychosis is seen as something lacking all meaning, and we do not afford or capacitate opportunities for people on their own terms to make meaning out of their experiences. This is a profound form, right, of injustice and oppression that plays out. Institutional impoverishment, if we zoom out from the level of individual clinical intervention to structures and systems, what we see is acceptance at the societal level among policymakers, among, kind of government officials in the US of an institutionalized impoverishment. People with SMI, almost all, right, with long-term psychiatric disabilities that are, impacting their life, almost all end up on SSI. To end up on SSI is by government regulation to be well below the poverty line in the United States and to be unable to escape from poverty without losing essential benefits, resources, and obviously healthcare here. And we accept that. We, all of us in this room, myself included, accept this, and there is a complacency around that this is just how things are, and they can't be differently, or at least we are not inspired enough to rise up and say that these institutional rules, these policies that entrap people in lifelong poverty, which impacts every single aspect of their lives, of what they can be in society, that we've decided that it's okay. And we rarely talk about this at conferences. And then racism, which is really part and parcel of poverty and socioeconomic inequality in the United States, right? Our socioeconomic policies are fundamentally racialized, are formed through structurally racist, kind of principles and practices. And beyond that, beyond those forms of structural racism, as I think all of you in this room know, racism plays out in very, very powerful and potent ways in the intersection of kind of stereotypes and conceptualizations of how Blackness and psychosis intersect. Jonathan Metzl, as many of you know, has written at length about this. And we literally see on a regular basis people being killed, right? We see all kinds of physical violence playing out in institutions and on the streets through police interaction, impacting members of the Black community who are also perceived to be experiencing some form of mental health crisis or psychosis. We've naturalized this, right? I think if it fully sunk into this, what this means and the depths of injustice and oppression, we would be doing things differently, right? We would be rising up in an organized way and saying, this is unacceptable and must change, and we would be asking ourselves as individuals what we are doing if we are not rising up in vocal, visible protest of these social conditions. But instead, we, those of us in academia, right, we write articles, we write papers, we present at conferences. What are we really doing to change things, right? So I want to just read this quote from Basaglia about the extent to which it is not about just tearing down the physical walls of institutions when we constantly reenact and reconstitute those walls in other ways. Mental illness will continue to be excluded by society until the fear, the rejection, and the exclusion disappear. Radical changes in social structures are needed. The development of new, organized, and modern psychiatric institutions very much means here institutions in the community, right? New kinds of institutions that we fool ourselves into thinking are somehow more emancipatory, more liberatory. This will not put an end to the problem of exclusion once our feelings of guilt have been addressed or assuaged. By building new institutions, we will end up transferring our hierarchical, authoritarian structures within transparent, invisible walls, but no less threatening walls as a constant source of exclusion, and that is where we still are. The status quo really has to change. And change is not, sort of speaking to the more original intended themes of this panel, it is not this growing movement of tokenistic integration of individuals with lived experience who have no power to more fundamentally influence or change agendas. This is, kind of hiring folks with lived experience at low levels in organizations, whether those are research or practice settings, that is integrating peer workers who are at the very bottom of the institutional hierarchy and have little to no power to actually fundamentally enact change, right? And this is, not caving into fear to name the institutional structures that are the real root of injustice in these spaces, right? And that includes extractive capitalism, every bit as much playing out in academia, in clinical training spaces, as it does in the community, in carceral institutions of various kinds. And the linked neoliberal values of self and self-advancement and self-promotion and self-professionalization over community in a deeper sense, of this sort of personal advancement over the giving up of power. Our society tells us to grab onto power, to hold it, to consolidate it, and to run with that, not to give it up. We want to virtue signal by saying, yeah, we're taking people who are minoritized along for the ride, and we are making no sacrifices of any kind in the process. And interventions and services that in fact reflect these values. We can use and deploy the rhetoric of recovery orientation, person-centered, trauma-informed, culturally competent or humble, and on. But in fact, the values in our system, in fact, our persistent and recalcitrant obsession with individual level intervention rather than social and structural change is tied to neoliberalism, is tied to extractive capitalism, and we need the courage to say no. So here I am citing the anthropologist Elizabeth Pavanelli, who's really describing, kind of her take on Foucault's work, especially the late Foucault. So the insurrection of knowledge depends on a certain sort of person who is either ethically otherwise and seeks to persevere in being so, or who seeks to be ethically otherwise and acts on and perseveres in this desire. It requires a kind of curiosity that permits one to cast off oneself, dépendre de soi-même, and become bewildered. It is a curiosity always attempting to think and see otherwise than the thinker and perceiver has thought and seen previously. It is an entitlement to explore what must be changed in thought through the practice of a knowledge that is foreign to it. In short, at its threshold of emergence, philosophy becomes ethics. So I think this is so important because part of what our culture, our kind of American or Anglo-American culture, kind of seeds within us, right, is this real self-righteousness, and current politics have only made that worse. So we are right? Whatever our position is, we are absolutely and utterly persuaded that we are right, and that we can just persist in doing whatever we think that is right? And this orientation to a deeper questioning, to both a belief that things can be different, but that also we are part of the problem. If we cannot embrace change in a deeper way, if we cannot embrace humility in a deeper way, take a very hard look at where things are in the system, in the US, at multiple levels, and say it must be different. And what about my comportment? What about the work I'm engaged in needs to change for things to truly change, right? Experience, and so I am not particularly fond of the term lived experience, right? Partly because it has been so quickly co-opted. As soon as the term was kind of like taken up within the system, it's co-opted. It comes to mean something very, very banal. But experience, when we're talking about experience of oppression, experience, for example, right, of being tied down in 4-point restraints, experience of being hammered and hammered and hammered with the idea that one's experiences have no real meaning and that one needs more and more and more antipsychotics, right, to ameliorate these symptoms. So these kinds of experiences, if they are taken up in the right way, because a values framework and an ethical orientation here is fundamental, if they are taken up in the right way, they have the potential to really thread the cracks that then let the light in, right? That help bring down oppressive systems. The answer is not a naive identity politics. This is not somebody has lived experience, and so we should just defer to whatever positionality they've adopted, right? We need to be respectful of what people have experienced, but real change depends on something more. So here I'm reading from the philosopher Donna Haraway, who is a key figure in standpoint epistemology, and she talks about the standpoints of the subjugated as incredibly important, but they are not enough. Simply occupying the standpoint of subjugation alone is not enough. So they are preferred because in principle they are least likely to allow denial of the critical and interpretive core of all knowledge, right? To understand that narratives are put forward that are in fact oppressive, that we do not need to accept, that the silencing and invisibilization of the violence that far too many people with psychiatric disabilities or labeled with them experience in the system, that is wrong, right? So of course we are going to see more potential for people to persist in speaking out, persist in naming the violence if they have actually experienced that violence. They are knowledgeable of modes of denial through repression, forgetting, and disappearing acts, ways of being nowhere while claiming to see comprehensively. So she is writing about the view from above. Here we could say that's the view from the powers that be, from the mainstream psychiatric system. That view from above is what invisibilizes, invalidates, right? That view from above is what gaslights, if you will. And people see that process because they are on the receiving end of it, and again, are more likely, but in no sense guaranteed, to then speak out. Such preferred positioning is as hostile to various forms of relativism as to the most explicitly totalizing versions of claims to scientific authority. But the alternative to relativism is not totalization and single vision, which is always finally the unmarked category whose power depends on systematic narrowing and obscuring. The alternative to relativism is partial, locatable, critical knowledges sustaining the possibility of webs of connections called solidarity in politics and shared conversations in epistemology. Relativism and totalization are both God tricks, promising vision from everywhere and nowhere, equally and fully. Common myths in rhetoric surrounding science. But it is precisely in the politics and epistemology of partial perspectives that the possibility of sustained, rational, objective inquiry rests. So bringing people in, right? Or I don't even want to say at this point bringing people in, but deferring, right, to folks who have experienced in a sense the lies that scaffold the system that we have come to naturalize, right? The lies that help scaffold the fact that this is natural, normal, inevitable, how we live, there is no other way. Having been on the receiving end of that makes it more likely that one sees through that lie and can speak to it, speak truth to power. So in conclusion, I'm not sure how I feel about any of the research that I'm currently engaged in. A big part of me, having seen something really and truly different embodied and actualized in Trieste, makes me feel that the research that I'm engaged in misses the plot entirely. That what we need is the courage to do something quite different. And we need the courage for those of us who are in various kinds of institutional settings to kind of throw off that feeling of necessity around doing what the system tells you should be doing, and in place of something that is more truly in line with social justice. And that takes a lot of courage. And in reflecting on myself, I think, boy, have I lacked that courage up to this point. In Trieste, I see courage. I don't see it here. I don't see it in myself. Humility, and again, I think reflecting a lot on the extent to which we are all constantly presenting as if we're right, we know the path. Humility is so kind of unrewarded and unsupported, and yet so crucial to be able to admit that we don't really know the way forward. We don't know what is best for the patients or service users we're working for. We don't know what is best for anyone, but we can come together as communities and as a process, engage in a process of working towards social justice. Sorry, I don't know what that is. Okay, thanks, sorry. Embracing moral discomfort without obscuring it, because we should all, each and every one of us, those of us with lived experience, those of us working in the nonprofit sector, those of us in academia, we should all feel deep moral discomfort about what is happening in this country and what is happening in the mental health system in this country. It is not okay. We should not be going about our daily work as if things were not happening right underfoot, right? That are morally unconscionable, that should shock the conscience, but are not shocking us, are no longer shocking to us. And then ethical commitments that go along with that, and what I increasingly feel really has to involve a moral and or spiritual conscience, because we have to have a commitment to something that is deeper than getting publications, than some banal form of quality improvement, than implementing whatever our favorite therapy is, expanding that therapy, right? It has to be something more than that. That is not enough. That is not enough to animate social change or drive it. And ultimately then, it is that commitment that we have to take up. And I'm not sure how many kind of conferences, whether we're talking ISPS or any of the other mental health, psychiatry, psychosis, or schizophrenia conferences in the US, where we're even talking about a commitment to justice in community, much less trying to operationalize what it means to go back out in the world and do things differently. All right, thank you guys, and I will now turn it over to, I think Andrew is next.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be able to present, albeit remotely. I'm Andrew. I'm a lived experience researcher. based at UCL London and the University of Manchester. And I want to use this time to present some work that I've done, which was part of my PhD, looking at lived experience perspectives and experiences of risk assessment and risk management in an acute psychiatric setting. As you'll know, the area around risk assessment, risk management, it's saturated with professional perspectives as to what risk looks like, what good risk assessment practice looks like. And there's actually very little evidence captured from a lived experience perspective. And as someone who's experienced psychiatric inpatient risk assessment and risk management, and someone who's experienced that directly and experienced it as quite intrusive, hostile at times, coercive, and done behind your back without sort of covertly. And I was quite surprised that there wasn't much evidence out there from a lived experience perspective, which is a real driver for why I did this study. I did a critical ethnography, so I used both observations and interviews, 4 months of intensive observations across the different spaces around the ward, followed up with some semi-structured interviews with staff members across a different range of roles and 11 service users, inpatients, across different kinds of what you might call risk profiles. I had wanted to look at service users' own risk assessment documents, but I excluded those because when I looked at them, there were no risk assessments that included a section from the service user themselves in the service user's own words. Now, that is best practice, but I couldn't find any evidence of that. So I actually excluded documents from the study. So 5 themes really came out of this work. And the first theme was around how service users were framing concerns around risk in very experiential terms, as you might expect. So all the names here are pseudonyms. I prefer to use pseudonyms rather than sort of ID numbers, as I feel that dehumanizes people. So these are pseudonyms. But this was in an informal discussion during a period of observation. And Maria says, risk of suicide or of hurting yourself is a really emotionally sensitive area. So it's hard to let people in so that they can know what you're thinking and feeling and what you're going through with all the difficulties you've been experiencing. Then there's a pause. And then she adds, but you have to let someone in so that they can help you. So here, this notion of risk is something that's sensitive, that's difficult to express. It's knowledge of the inner world of what someone's thinking and experiencing, feeling. So there is knowledge of the inner world, but it's important knowledge that staff need to know so that they can offer person-centered support. A second theme was around the importance of one-to-ones with staff, of building relationships so that you can begin to share that sensitive and difficult but important knowledge. So Julia, in an interview, said you need honesty so that patients are really actually disseminating information about how they feel in their own safety zone, their own vulnerabilities, making real connections with the staff so that they can talk about what is most concerning to them. And therefore, the staff would then be able to assess what the risks actually are for that particular patient. So not rocket science, really, that building trusting relationships could help with this, sharing honestly about how you're feeling about risk and safety. Now, as people were sharing knowledge of their inner world with others, with staff, there were some dynamics at play. So it was both about enhancing your own knowledge about yourself. So Danielle puts it in terms of thinking about triggers was a real eye-opener for me. I got to know myself a lot better, the things that really stressed me out and could put me at risk of harming myself again. So this idea of gaining more knowledge about yourself, what your early warning signs are, your triggers, that was an important outcome of sharing. Another important outcome was around developing new knowledge. And here this was tended to focus on learning coping strategies or coping skills to help manage the situation. So service users looking for opportunity to share their inner struggles with staff so they can get to know themselves better, but also develop new knowledge to help cope with these difficult situations. So whilst there's all this sharing going on and there's experiential knowledge that's being shared, there's also, of course, clinical knowledge operating on the ward. And this is how Kelly put it in an interview. It's observational risk assessments, just stuff going off in your head like constantly it's almost like subconscious, she says. But I think in most nurses' heads, it's just constantly. And you might not even think, right, I'm assessing their risk now, because you sort of do it automatically. So this idea that as you're observing, you're building up a picture in your head, and she then attributes that to what other nurses are doing as well, whilst recognizing that has its limits. And so unless you talk to the individual, you don't know what's happening in their head. And so this notion that you might misread what's happening or what's going on, or you might miss important things. But of course, one problem with this being internalized is that as a service user, I don't have access to what's going on in that nurse's head. Here there was this notion of this knowledge that's being generated. It's hidden, it's covert, and that produces knowledge deficits for service users themselves. So Jimmy says they barely mention risk assessment, which is odd when you think about how important it is here in this setting. But I think it's deliberate. Maybe they think we don't need to know, but I want to know. So Jimmy really wants to know what they're thinking about his risk, his level of risk, and so on. Mickey, similarly, they don't share their thinking with you, so you don't know how risky they think you are or how they've come to that conclusion. So this is all hidden, it's covert. And this produces lots of knowledge deficits. We just don't know what on earth is going on here. But this is where I wanted to focus really on theme 4, because what I started to see that when clinical knowledge hits experiential knowledge, what I found was that time after time, experiential knowledge gets downplayed, dismissed, marginalized, and clinical knowledge takes precedence, with sometimes terrible impacts. So I spoke to Gareth when I consented him to the study, and this is how he described his risk. He says, I don't remember much. I just remember spiders everywhere and running away from my house, not even dressed properly. And he says, my fear is my risk. I was scared of the spiders and the government was out to get me. So I lashed out at police and somehow ended up here. So you can see here, perhaps from a professional perspective, there are things that immediately come up in terms of self-neglect, not being dressed properly, violence and aggression, lashing out at police. But from Gareth's perspective, his primary risk is this fear around spiders and around the government. But this is how that was managed in a ward round. Caroline the nurse, do you think anything about that is unusual and that these are unusual thoughts. We feel the medication will help you, and that the psychiatrist chips in and that it will shorten your time with us. We feel you are still unwell. Gareth says, I'm not unwell. I'm taking up a bed and I don't understand why I'm still here. And Caroline says, well, we've talked about your unusual beliefs. And then once Gareth has left the ward round, the summary, these spiders and conspiracies, very bizarre. And the psychiatrist says, yes, and a very fixed delusion, but that obviously that will pass once we get the antipsychotic back into his system. So can you see here that Gareth's experiential knowledge, his fear here is being completely downplayed and dismissed because it's unusual. It's bizarre. He's not making any sense. These spiders, they're not real. This is the delusion. Therefore, we don't have to take it seriously or do anything about it, or we don't have to assess or manage this issue. And that just leaves Gareth feeling neglected, really. Similarly, here's another example. This was during handover discussion. So Caroline says, Maggie had a one-to-one with staff last night, saying she will overdose if she goes off the ward with intention to self-harm. Now, how might you expect this conversation to go? You might expect it to go, how can we support Maggie then to take some leave? How can she best be supported? But this is how the conversation went. She is one of those who will sabotage the treatment plan. I think she will always be a risk. How do we proceed? The nurse says she has to be accountable for her own actions. Should we discharge her? She's due ward round on Thursday. She will always be a risk. But there are key social issues. These EUPD, so emotionally unstable personality disorder, they're fully concentrated on themselves with no concern for her children. EUPDs will harm themselves when put on informal. These people deliberately say these things about wanting to see the children. And Micah says, it's game playing, isn't it? Suggest you stay on general and we therapeutically risk it. Suicide is not an immediate risk, maybe accidental, but she needs to take therapeutic responsibility for her actions. She has the capacity and consent to receive love bites on her cheek, which she wants to explain to staff. So I guess the thinking there is, well, she has capacity for other things too. She should be on general obs subject to ongoing risk assessment. So can you see here that in this instance, because Maggie has been judged to have EUPD, she's therefore seen as manipulating. So she's therefore seen to be accountable and to take responsibility for her own actions. Therefore, her sense of distress has been completely downplayed, marginalized, dismissed. Here's a final example. This was in a one-to-one. And this is Julia really responding to the consultant's diagnosis. So I'm not going to go with her diagnosis, her risk assessment, or her treatment plan for the sake of an easy life because it's wrong. And the nurse says, what is it you disagree with in particular? That I have a subtle psychosis, that I'm delusional, that I need to take an antipsychotic. If something's so subtle, does it really fit the diagnosis? I think that's a really insightful question. It's not really my place to say, but I can see why that would be frustrating, the nurse says. I've calmed down now, but I'm really worried that I've given her more ammunition against me. What do you mean? I think I'm being too aggressive and too assertive in my ward rounds, and that's feeding her idea that I'm too risky, too hostile, and that's feeding her idea that I'm unwell. So can you see Julia's really caught in this kind of vicious circle? She's protesting too much or being too assertive, then she's at risk of being judged to be risky and unwell and therefore in need of containment and so on. But again, she's sort of playing the game in order to get out, really. So really, when when clinical knowledge was hitting experiential knowledge, clinical knowledge was taking precedence, experiential knowledge was being completely marginalized and dismissed, and leaving people feeling neglected and their primary concerns unaddressed. And the final thing really was then that people were wanting tangible involvement in this process. So not only should it be overt and people should have access to what's going on and these processes and so on, it should be tangible. And this particularly focused around documentation. So Denise says, I think it's imperative that the documentation's got your involvement in it and you know it's a working document that's being looked at and has not just been filled in and sat somewhere. It may well be being used as that, but I think unless that's being portrayed to us, then it's not got a lot of points because they know what they're doing anyway. It's we who don't. So being able to see your risk assessment, being able to contribute to its formulation, having it as a working document, really then helping people to be tangibly involved in this process. There were all sorts of implications to practice around what needs to happen in these different steps and processes of the ward round in order to enable our testimonies to be truly heard. So research then conducted from a lived experience perspective, I think really helps us to begin to centre service users' own risk narratives of their risk experiences, so that their primary concerns are being managed and dealt with, and so that we're not left dismissed, marginalised, and our concerns downplayed, and that in this way, you could have a more open, honest, trust relationship. That's me. Thank you so much for listening.
So we're going to start our Q&A. We have about 20 minutes. So we'll be taking questions both from our folks online. So if you could enter your comments and questions in the chat or in the Q&A function. We'll also take some questions and comments from our in-person audience. So I'm just going to go for the hands that I see first and bring the mic to you. So please make yourself known to me. I go here first and then I'll come over there.
Thanks everyone, really enlightening presentations. Matt Jackman here. I guess I often think of mental health as a microcosm of the rest of society. And I think Nev, you touched on this, given the co-option of lived experience, advocates and activists into the system of, Western colonial capitalist psychiatric systems where our humanity is being medicalized and economized. I guess as idealistic pragmatists, how do we engage in the collective project of social movement work and social change, as it's very hard to bite the hand that feeds you. So how do we do that?
Thanks, Matt. I think we would probably similarly say as Alison ended too, this is hugely difficult work. And I guess, maybe where I would start is that we really need a movement, and we really need people to come together and really demand something different. And that right now in the US, and probably one could say most other countries, we have no such movement. We're not even demanding change. We're not looking at social structures like here in the US. I think more work actually is happening in Australia from the sort of the user lived experience community, really involvement in the NDIS. You don't even see that here. And so if we don't have that, we don't even have our starting point, because this is not something that isolated individuals can accomplish alone. I would love to, because we're here at ISPS-US specifically, I would love to see organizations like ISPS really take up the charge here, right? I think historically, ISPS internationally probably has really contributed actually to a focus on individual level psychotherapy and has not come together to really engage in structural critique. So this is one organization that exists internationally that could potentially join together with others. And, you know, at a minimum, we have to be moving in that direction, starting to have those conversations. So, I mean, I don't at all have the answers. It's very frustrating and difficult work, as you know, just trying to bring people together when there is so much kind of fracturing, and when it's so much easier for people to sort of point the finger at each other than it is to say there really are problems here, there really is deep injustice here. The deep injustice is not some other person in my own movement who isn't doing what I want them to do, but there is a bigger picture change that we need to join together, embrace, and work towards. But, you know, as you know, this is really challenging.
Yeah, I think I would second that. As I said, I think I'm in a very similar place as you, where like I definitely, I guess my head butts up against ideological purity and ideological pragmatism, and like what, you know, how realistically do we take tangible steps forward, and how do we collectively take tangible steps forward when so many people have different experiences, perspectives, etc. I know, you know, for me, I certainly have always been very, very moved and inspired by the work of the Hearing Voices movement, and sort of what as a movement voice hearers sort of in that domain have been able to accomplish, because I think it has actually been massive, even though, you know, the Hearing Voices movement is not necessarily, you know, there's a lot of different sort of factions of it that advocate for different things, and in different countries, sort of the flavors of it, if you will, are slightly different. But I do think that as sort of a sort of user-led grassroots organization, we can see the impact of sort of HVN in terms of shifting public attitudes towards voice hearing, certainly in terms of shifting clinical attitudes towards voice hearing, certainly in terms of, you know, creating alternatives. You know, we see places like Wildflower Alliance, who's done that absolutely brilliantly. And I think there is a lot of learning that can come from movements like that.
And yeah, Andrew, jump in. I know it's a little, just jump in if you want to add stuff.
Yeah, I will. No, I've got nothing to add to that one.
Okay. Yeah, I had a question that is actually constantly morphing in my mind as I hear the answers. I originally was going to also ask the "what do you do" question, but then I was thinking, you know, to what degree you know, Nev's suggestion is we can't just look at these individual interventions. We have to think of the larger structural issues, and that's a very good point. And I'm wondering, though, whether some of these interventions we're into could actually help change those structural things. I mean, it's kind of like what Alison just said with Hearing Voices. You talked about maybe kind of normalizing, you know, sort of more open attitudes towards voices. But is it possible also that the Hearing Voices movement also might be, in a way, anti-neoliberal? You know, in a way, I'm thinking of how it's, you know, it's all sort of peer and volunteer led, or minimally paid, and not commodified yet. You know, who knows, that could happen. But or maybe even like looking at something like SSI, you know, and how something could be maybe more, there might be a more empowering alternative to focus on SSI itself rather than capitalism in its entirety. So I'm wondering if these incremental changes with movements we're already pushing might have, you know, realms of possibility for helping these larger changes.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, that's certainly a possibility. I think, you know, in terms of what I've seen in the UK, it's sort of the legacy of HVN and sort of talking with voices. And, you know, this morning, Professor Steele was talking about how, you know, when he was doing his case series, there was, I think, a lot more resistance from psychiatry on the idea of talking to voices. And, you know, I've been working on talking with voices for the past 5 years now, we've encountered almost no resistance from clinical services and from psychiatrists. And so that is, you know, a pretty big shift. And it's certainly not what we had anticipated. We anticipated a lot of resistance. So I think sometimes there can be sort of incremental shifts sort of from sort of individual therapeutic interventions. I think potentially there's more scope for those shifts when it comes from movements like HVN that are a bit more sort of explicitly focused on trying to make those shifts. I'm just like, I don't know, reflecting as I'm talking, but I think one of the things that I think is both hard, but I think an opportunity with both movements, I think actually primarily with social movements, is that I think they can operate sort of on multiple levels simultaneously. So there can be sort of that focus on how do we improve sort of more the individual structure, and then also a focus on how do we improve systems. You know, I think I've, at least in the involvement that I had with HVN up in Massachusetts, certainly I think saw that in terms of how do we actually physically create alternatives? How do we create peer support groups that are completely non-clinical, that, you know, do have a completely different ethos? And then also, how do we engage in direct protest when it's necessary? And I, you know, for me, that model was, for me personally, very transformative. And it's something that I've not seen in a lot of other places personally. But I think that, yeah, a lot of opportunity is there.
Yeah, I don't know if Andrew has anything to add to this. I mean, I think it's tricky because I actually think the way that the public media in the US has taken up the Hearing Voices movement is very much along the same, well, now we can just do this, and it is not redirecting our attention back to deeper structural issues. And I think that is just a fundamental kind of fallacy, isn't even the right word, right? It is a mechanism, it is a manifestation of kind of neoliberalism, extractive capitalism. And so I really, really, really worry we have to keep our eye and keep naming and talking about the real drivers of inequality and injustice. And anytime we're not, and anytime we are allowing or enabling, whether it's the media or policymakers, to say, oh no, it's this other thing that looks cheap and easy, because what is cheaper? What does capitalism love more than to say, we don't have to invest in these people. We don't have to do anything for them. Let them have their grassroots peer support groups. So I worry because I go to conference after conference, and the thing we're not talking about, I mean, there's very conservative conferences where you wouldn't even talk about the Hearing Voices movement. But even at the conferences where we talk about the Hearing Voices movement, we're not seriously talking about the structural issues. We're not talking about housing and SSI and, you know, the disability system and how it profoundly, materially impacts and reshapes people's lives. And there's only so much you can do if you are trapped in really extreme poverty, which is, you know, literally the reality, especially in more, you know, expensive urban parts of the US. So like, I just don't want us to remove our critical gaze from that, from talking about that and thinking about how we can organize around that. At the panel last night, which I realized everybody was not yet here for, I mean, I think our three, you know, elders in the movement, Will, Sasha, and Jax, all in different ways, were gesturing back towards the more radical origins of the movement. And if you go back and you look at Howie the Harp's original work, it was fundamental. He actually said SSI is the single biggest issue that impacts our movement, our community, our people. It's poverty, and we're not talking about it, and that is a problem. So if it's the Hearing Voices movement not talking about it, if it's the uptake, right? The media uptake of, here's a sexy romantic thing too, which is the other danger of Hearing Voices, right? It's the most romanticized side of quote unquote psychosis. That's a problem. And we need to be having the conversation. And then what are those steps? I mean, one could say very pragmatically, we have to have a voice in SSI reforms that are going on right now. And I can tell you that the mental health community is not at the table, has in a sense elected to not be at the table. And that's a problem. And that's not even something particularly radical to just engage in a sense, the most institutionalized process of policy reform in this country. So yes, and I think that we need to be inspired, and there has been, I mean, I've personally been very inspired, impacted, and also a part of the Hearing Voices movement. But we need something more, and I'm not seeing that, and I think we need a movement that frontally, explicitly embraces that.
Hi, thanks for your inspiring conversation. I see sort of a parallel with in talking about trauma. I mean, I'm old enough to have been hearing for decades and decades about trauma and psychosis, and we have known this for decades. and we never do anything about it. I think nobody wants to do, and when I say society in general doesn't want to do anything about it, and that's really the resistance, and why we every 10 years we have to be like, oh my God, there's an association between trauma and psychosis, as if I've heard this for a long time, but we don't have any interventions at that social level. And I think part of the issue, if we look at this intersectionally, is there are a lot of people who consider their communities to be under-resourced in terms of mental health. So there's part of us saying, the treatment available is harmful and problematic. But there are a lot of people in poverty saying, I don't even have access to see a psychiatrist, and we want more of this treatment because that's what the treatment is. And I think there's a disconnect somewhat sort of academically looking at these systems of oppression where people who are in that are still reaching for just what everybody else has and we're seeing as problematic. And I think that's partly why it's hard to get enough of a grassroots movement to try to change some of those things. We have parents calling in, wanting their kids on assisted outpatient and this medication, and how come I can't get an appointment, and that kind of thing. So I think, to me, I see that's where some of the holdup is, in a way. And also, we don't have a mental health system here. So to try to change it, there's just a series of reactions, political reactions to tragedies is what we have. It's not really a system. At least in the UK, there is an actual system to change. We don't even have a system here.
Just really quickly, I think we have to name internalized oppression, which is as old as history, right? And we have come to accept things that should be, ethically repugnant to us, and disenfranchised communities in particular, right, who are, really experience the heft and the weight of oppressive systems generation after generation. And this is really why I read the Donna Haraway quote, right? We have to have critical analysis in the picture. It's not enough to just say, well, but there are some families who are pressing for more incarceration, expansion of AOT, expansion of civil commitment. It's not enough to say, well, because they want that, we need to respect that. We have to have a deeper analysis. And I think, I didn't go into sort of conscientization, but, this is where, Paulo Freire and others in the Latin American context were coming from. Deep acceptance that this is just what we get. This is what we deserve. This is a good thing, right? These oppressors, that's just how it is. And when we have so depoliticized things and so caved into a kind of very superficial kind of relativism, whatever anybody asks for must be good because they're asking for it, that's a fundamental problem. And so, conscientization is understanding that a system, whether it is incarceration through the criminal legal system or incarceration through AOT, that those two things are not terribly different, right? And, I think for some folks in the room know that I am co-leading a big evaluation of assisted outpatient treatment or compulsory treatment orders across New York State right now. We hear this again and again. Desperate families and communities who are saying, oh, AOT is so much better than incarceration, give us more of that. And it is brutal and it is violent, and we need to, again, build real community, not this sort of superficial deference, anything goes relativism, but like a real community that can critically unpack, why have we ended up here? Why have we ended up or believing or accepting that this is actually a good way to go and we need more of it? And where is our attention to the deeper systems or structures that lead tens of thousands of people in New York State alone into AOT, right? Many of whom still, in spite of AOT, end up hospitalized, incarcerated, and or brutalized in various ways through police interaction. So I think that we have to have that courage. And right now there's just a lot of, well, if XYZ community asks, well, no matter what it is, it's just good, or we should just do that. That's not policy. That's not critical policy. So how can we have those conversations in a way that's not about leaving people behind, that is about developing that critical consciousness from the bottom up, which is what all social justice movements, in fact, that have succeeded have always done, as I think kind of Will Hall said last night, the women's movement, the Black Power movement, labor movements, right, farm workers movement in the Southwest. All of it has been about communities coming together to recognize that something deeper is driving what is happening in those communities, and that change is fundamental and necessary. Sorry, that was long.
Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge our online community here and ask a question on their behalf. So question from Cassie: how do we address forces that are crushing existing movements, particularly in the US? Many of us are movement minded, but are ground down one by one through strategic capitalist efforts to dismantle movements. And then a second question from another, from Sherilyn, which I think is related. How can you make change when the big systems control the money?
Andrew, I keep wanting to defer to you if you want to jump in. I know that was kind of a little bit maybe about the US movement scene, which may or may not reflect similar kind of fracturing and dismantling in the UK. So
Yeah, I think, in terms of forces that are crushing existing movements, I think reclaiming saneism and talking about saneism and addressing saneism and structural stigma, because what I was seeing in my study was that you've got all this sort of sanist, all these stereotypes around EUPDs or people with psychosis as being bizarre and used to marginalize us, and yet no one is calling this out. And so I think it's important that we're calling out saneism as saneism. I think the sort of stigma stuff tends to just focus on internalized stigma and the individual and what's happening at the individual level. And we need to constantly look at what's happening on a societal level and just, calling it out.
those were really good questions. I think that, I hope over the course of the next 2 days that we can have more conversations about how we can come together rather than end up fragmented and divided. I really, really do, because absolutely that is one of the biggest barriers that stands in our way. I think, again, isolated individuals will change nothing. We have to find ways to come together, and it's very difficult, and being here together in person, in communion, is a real opportunity.
All right, we have to stop there. That's a nice way to punctuate your talk. Thank you, Alison, Andrew, and Nev for your panel this morning. We really appreciate it.